Hello, my name is Bill Macross. First, a brief introduction. This wasn't originally going to be my first video. I have been working for several weeks on a different video that I planned on being my inaugural one, but I just could not pass up the calling I felt to respond to this article in the New York Times. So here I am, a few weeks early, and a bit behind on production value. Anyway. You've likely heard the name Jordan Peterson before. Whether it be from normie trash, wrecked leftist compilations on YouTube, literally any podcast, or if it's a deeper familiarity with his writings. If you haven't heard his name before, then I'm sorry to say you are lacking the prerequisite information necessary for the rest of this video to make any sense. But assuming you have heard of him, you're likely aware of the recent article released by the New York Times titled, Jordan Peterson, Custodian of the Patriarchy. If you haven't actually read the article yet, the link is in the description. I not only recommend that you read it before continuing this video, I insist that you do so that you are familiar with the content that I'm about to criticize. Beatles. This article can, in my opinion, be fairly called a hit piece. But not because I am some Jordan B. Peterson apologist, as I have been accused of being. Mainly because I don't believe Peterson has anything to apologize for, at least not within the context of this article. I would call this a hit piece due to the lazy stuffing of content and the deliberate mischaracterization of Peterson's words. So what do I mean by this? Well, to start out, the subtitle of the article is, "He says there's a crisis in masculinity. Why won't women, all of these wives and witches, just behave?" This is an obvious attempt, right from the start, to attribute Peterson as being someone who thinks women should just blindly and willfully submit to the men in their lives. This, I can only imagine, is a massive reach regarding two other points Peterson makes in the interview. One regarding the archetype of the witch in the Hansel and Gretel story, which is essentially a metaphor for the smothering mother who never lets the children grow up, and keeps them sheltered in a childishly desirable gingerbread house for eternity. The other being the Peterson claim that he has had personal conversation with many young women who express desire to become housewives, but would never admit it publicly for fear of social outcast, because wanting to be a housewife is forbidden in the current political, social, ideologically egalitarian climate. I don't think that I need to explain how these two examples of Peterson's words have absolutely nothing to do with the forced submission of women to the authority of men. So essentially, this article can be divided up into four basic parts. Number one, blatant insults to Peterson on a personal level, both unnecessary and unproductive. Two, the New York Times deliberately misled interpretation of Peterson's words, as demonstrated previously. Three, small interviews with other people on how they view the work of Jordan Peterson. Four, direct quotes from Peterson. So I will address these in this order, in what is likely progressing importance. Number one, blatant insults. These do not need to be addressed much, honestly. Whether it be the New York Times insulting the way Peterson sits as being less than masculine, which I thought the ultimate goal of progressivism was to remove masculine expression from both public and private life, so I find it odd that the way he has changed his personal style of dress over the past several years, the fact that he doesn't ever smile, which he does, how he dresses during his private Skype conversations, or how he has chosen to decorate his house. Several of these aren't direct insults, but the tone of the article and the presentation of these particular facts, or rather, selectively chosen observations, indicates a detectable level of disdain for them. This is just a personal observation of my own, but the New York Times seems, to me, to actually be presenting Peterson as some sort of Antichrist character, or at least a falsely messianic archetype. Obviously, I believe this to be an attempt at soft discrediting, but maybe I'm reaching too far. This is by no means meant to say that I personally see Peterson as a messianic figure in any capacity, nor do I think anybody should, but it seems as if the New York Times wants the readers to see him as one in a negative light. They even go so far as to call his public speeches sermons, which I personally think is beyond inappropriate. I recognize that they may be referring to his biblical lectures that he gave in 2017, but I don't think that those can rightfully be called sermons by anyone, considering Jordan Peterson himself has claimed he doesn't actually put any stock in the physical existence of any type of deity, rather it was his psychological approach to the underlying meanings and the underlying narratives of the biblical stories from one book in the Bible, in the Old Testament, to be specific. I don't think these can rightfully be called sermons. I don't think anybody believes these can rightfully be called sermons. Number 2, the New York Times deliberately misleading interpretations of Peterson's words. I'm not going to cover every instance of this here because that would take quite a bit of time, so I'll cover the big obvious instances. A. Firstly, we see the egregious mislead on his words in the subtitle. This is obviously a conscious attempt to get the readers to, from the start, have a bad opinion of Peterson's character in Poison the Well. Especially considering a lot of people don't finish the articles that they start reading. This is a pretty tactical manner to get a lot of ignorant Redditor types to pick up an initial bad opinion and walk away with just that. There's a saying on Reddit that's commonly thrown around something along the lines of Redditors only read the title anyway. So, there's that. Moving on. B. It is claimed that, quote, in Jordan Peterson's world, order is masculine, chaos is feminine, unquote. This is not necessarily true. Peterson has pulled this perspective from so many of the overwhelmingly unanimous narratives that humanity has strung along the path of its progression since long before recorded history. This isn't Jordan Peterson's made-up world where this is the case. This is Jordan Peterson's objective observation of the world that surrounds him and everyone else. C. It is then claimed that Jordan Peterson claims that white privilege is a farce. This is simply untrue. Peterson does not claim that white privilege is a farce. Please watch the recent debate between Peterson and several others on political correctness. I will have linked it in the description. Peterson is well aware of the privileges that do exist in society. He is aware that everybody is granted no insignificant level of privileges in their life, and likewise, everybody is granted no insignificant level of disadvantages as well. And he is aware that not everybody stacks up equally at the starting line. He knows this, and he laments this frequently. Anybody familiar with his writing, his lectures, or his work in general, I'm certain will be aware of this. D. Next up, we've got, quote, wherever he goes, he speaks in sermons about the inevitability of who we must be, unquote. This I cannot even call a deliberately poor interpretation, but rather an outright lie. The core of his recent book, 12 Rules for Life, is a manifesto about changing who you are for the better in small ways. Peterson claims, in this book and elsewhere, that he finds it miraculous that people aren't all alcoholics and drug addicts all of the time. If we were to be who we must be, we would all devolve into the deepest level of the chaotic underworld all of the time, and we would stay there forever. Being ghosts with no focus or purpose in the world is far easier than wrangling with purpose and meaning. It would be far less a resistant path for people to all always be that way. But oddly enough, we aren't. And Peterson has literally dedicated his life to helping people become the best versions of themselves that they can be, not the destined versions of themselves that they have to be. E. Quote, he looks down while he talks and makes fleeting, suspicious eye contact, unquote. This should probably have gone in the blatant insults portion, but I had to put it here. Now, I obviously wasn't physically present during the interview, but of every interview with Peterson that I have ever watched, every debate that I have seen him partake in, and I dare say I have seen at least the majority thereof, Peterson keeps eye contact with his counterparts, and certainly does not display such beta male behavior as looking down as he speaks. I have never seen him display such behavior when he is engaging in one-on-one interactions. So I simply find it hard to believe that this one interview, his personality changed this drastically. F. Quote, he dragged the school into controversy in 2016 by opposing a Canadian bill that he believed would compel him to use a student's preferred pronouns, unquote. Now, I am certainly no expert in Canadian law. However, I have read the bill, and it is pretty clear to me that this is exactly what Bill C-16 will do. But please don't take my word for it, read it for yourself. A link to the full text of the bill will be in the description. So as far as I can tell, the New York Times saying Peterson believes that the bill will compel him to do so implies that it is either unknown or incorrect, the truth on this matter. And it seems to me that it is very obvious that Peterson's concerns are completely accurate. So maybe this isn't a misread of his words, but I would at the very least call it a soft lie against him. G. Quote, the left, he believes, refuses to admit that men might be in charge because they are better at it, unquote. followed by Peterson saying, quote, "The people who hold that our culture is an oppressive patriarchy, they don't want to admit that the current hierarchy might be predicated on competence," unquote. Now, this might be one of the harder ones to tackle, but it's still not that difficult. Peterson does not claim that all men should always be in charge by virtue of them being men. What Peterson means by this, and you can watch the Kathy Newman interview linked in the description for this one, if you haven't already, is that men tend to achieve certain positions of higher power more often than women because these particular positions of power are more appealing to men and require a set of skills that men are more likely to have than women, generally and statistically speaking. This is not to say that all men are always in charge of everything by virtue of being men. More men are more likely to be willing to work 100 hours every week for decades to become the CEO of a company than women are. Women are simply less likely to possess the desire and the conscientiousness to properly acquire such a position. That's it. If women are up to and capable of the task, then have at it. This isn't even to say that men control everything as it currently stands anyway. The demand of goods and services in the free market is heavily influenced, and thus controlled, by female consumers. To have made this a reliable claim, the New York Times need only add 9 words to it. Men might be in charge of the things that they are in charge of because they are better at them. H. Enforced monogamy. Now, this was the granddad of this article that has sparked outrage, and it's my personal favorite. So to quote Peterson regarding Alex Manassian and the other incel attackers of recent years, quote, "He was angry at God because women were rejecting him. The cure for that is enforced monogamy. That's actually why monogamy emerges. Half the men fail, and no one cares about the men who fail. A small percentage of the guys have hyper access to women, and so they don't form relationships with women. And the women hate that." Now, I didn't leave anything out here, aside from Peterson's sly remark to the interviewer when she laughed at him as he was speaking, which was not relevant, honestly. So the interviewer props this up as if Peterson is in favor of state-sponsored redistribution of brides. And if you take a brief look on Twitter or other various social media platforms, you'll see a very similar poor and malicious interpretation of this speech from Peterson. However, I can see how a malicious agent could come up with this interpretation. Peterson is, in all actuality, talking in descriptive terms, not prescriptive terms. At least, not directly prescriptive terms. To Peterson, monogamy is a system that was developed by human society long ago that attempted to solve the problem of high-status men being the only ones to procreate, and the inevitably violent revolt of the low-status men that nobody cares about. Essentially, X system was developed to solve Y problem. Now, I actually disagree with Peterson here. I think a better case can be made that monogamy is a system that initially emerged to accomplish a further focused system of raising children through lifelong pair bonding. But nonetheless, this system of monogamy at the very least serves also to solve, at least partially, this incel problem we see today. So, Peterson isn't even necessarily saying monogamy should be enforced to keep the incels from acting up, and the government should enforce that women just be given to them like welfare. This is actually, as far as I can tell, an utterly revolting misrepresentation, if not an outright deception, of Peterson's character in his words. Peterson is simply saying that one system solves a certain problem. It also solves another problem. That concerns both genders. If this system were in place, it would help solve both of these problems. Now, I've hit 8 examples at this point, and I think that it is enough to get my point across on this. However, I'd like to further expand on the last point a bit more. I don't think that endorsing a monogamous system is a bad thing at all. I certainly don't think that the government should be getting itself involved in restricting people's personal, behind-closed-doors lives, but I certainly don't think it would be good to provide legal incentive to engage in such behavior. The Mormons were mocked, almost unanimously, for their attempts to integrate a polygamous culture into the Western world. Every sex cult that emerges receives the same treatment, rightfully so. Monogamy has, regarding the legal status of marriage, always been enforced. So why, all of a sudden, is that cornerstone of our culture being attacked? Polygamous relationships that have long-lasting results aren't common in a culture where entering those relationships is consensual from all parties involved. It is not a good long-term solution that commonly displays positive results. And this is coming from someone who would likely benefit from such a system in the short term. Statistically speaking, most examples of polyamorous relationships that the world has to offer are very male-centric. Sure, Maybe some examples exist of it working long term, but I don't know of any evidence to suggest that this would be the trend. And as stated earlier, I believe it to be an objectively inferior system for the purpose of child raising. Now that was my personal opinion. I certainly don't think I can be called some monogamy apologist or a JBP apologist, because I simply don't think that there is anything to apologize for. But I'm not particularly finished with this topic. The notion of enforced monogamy is, I will repeat, not a suggestion that the state get involved in policing the private lives of any individuals, but rather it is the notion of a social institution that heralds pair bonding, monogamous relationships, especially as they pertain to raising children and the acquisition of private property. Your promiscuous behavior is not necessarily of any concern to any other individual, but rather, if you bring it into the open public space and advocate it as a cornerstone of cultural norms, any individual has the right to ridicule you for it, since such a system is an objectively inferior system with regards to the allocation of resources necessary to raise children for the future. Because in the end, that is what this is all about. Enforced monogamy should be a social pressure, not a legal one. And it has been for roughly 18,000 years at least. Some evidence suggests longer, as in a few million years longer. But I have not done an immense amount of prerequisite study on this topic, so let's say 18,000 years. Even still, the notion of tearing down a socially evolved institution that is 18,000 years old is a task that should be performed at your peril. It's kind of funny, actually, to see the radical left, and that is to say 90% of the American left, is now criticizing the notion of monogamy itself. A political commentator named Ben Shapiro has a bit of an observation about Donald Trump, in that the Donald has a superpower of getting the radical left, and that is to say 90% of the American left, to defend the most egregious entity just by criticizing it himself. At the time that I am recording this, the radical left, and that is to say 90% of the American left, is currently defending both Hamas, the terrorist organization, with the explicit goal of finishing Hitler's final solution, and MS-13, one of the most rabid and vile criminal gangs that exists in America right now. But I think Peterson has a similar power. It seems that Peterson has the ability to get the radical left, and that is to say 90% of the American left, to assault and attack any ideal or institution by mere virtue of his heralding of it. And that is, at the very least, quite entertaining. The rest of the article consists of direct quotes from Peterson, which have more or less been expanded upon already, and very small interviews with both supporters and critics of Peterson. However, the New York Times doesn't dive much deeper into the quotes of these interviews, at least they don't discuss them to the level that I feel it be worth addressing for the sake of this video. So that's going to wrap things up for me for this video. I didn't plan on opening up my channel with this video, but I simply had to respond to this article because I honestly just thought it was such trash that I couldn't not say something about it. So at this point, you know the whole subscribing and liking ordeal here. But I'm genuinely interested in the feedback you may have. So please, leave a comment. Just please make it coherent if you're going to be lobbying criticisms. I can't improve my content if you call me a fascist pig. I'm not Marco Pagat, but you can expect more content soon. In any event, make good decisions until I see you again. Later.